All right. Well, welcome. It is good to see you guys today. We're so happy that you're able to join us for this, which is our second in our ISO Bites series. Now, I'm Erin Reed. I'm the marketing manager for Polaris MEP, and I'm just here to kick off today's discussion with Chris Cinieri. We call these things ISO bites because each time we try to take a little bite out of the ISO or other quality management system certification apple. And for those of you who haven't worked with us yet, I just wanted to make sure that you knew who we are. Who is Polaris MEP? Polaris MEP is a nonprofit consulting group, and our sole mission is to help small and medium-sized manufacturers in the state of Rhode Island. We do this in a variety of ways, but today what we're most interested in is how we help manufacturers through quality management services. Quality management systems is actually one area in which we support manufacturers by helping you create and then maintain the framework that helping you ensure that you can pursue an ISO certification or whatever certification helps you meet your business goals, and then to make sure that you can continue to comply with the standards that are imposed upon you by customers, by your industry, or by federal regulations. And today, even though it's not called non-compliance, it's called nonconformance, we are talking about how to make sure that we are keeping in line with that. And we've got a great guide for today's discussion, and it is our project manager, Chris Cinieri. Chris leads the delivery of our quality management services and training, and has helped countless clients achieve and maintain their ISO certification. He is also the president of the Rhode Island chapter of the American Society for Quality. Did I get that right?
You did. Thank you.
I'm close enough. So we're going to go ahead and let Chris get going. And please, if you have any questions today, we do have a cozy group. So either use the chat feature to type something in, and we'll make sure that I funnel it to Chris, or just go ahead and unmute yourself and say, hey, I've got a burning question about nonconformance and corrective actions that I've always wanted to ask Chris Cinieri. Chris?
Well, thank you, Erin. So it's absolutely a great day to be talking about this despite the weather. Thank you for the introduction. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today as well. So like Erin said, we're creating a series of fast-paced, information-packed webinars to take a bite out of a particular requirement of the ISO 9001 standard. Our goal is to help clarify expectations, to give you some insight into the requirement, and provide some actionable tips that you can take back to your company and use. So let's begin. Now, if you've ever worked with me before in the past, you know I always like to say, let's go to the standard. So let's start with some definitions, and these come from ISO 9000. And I know everybody has their copy of ISO 9000 tucked away on the server, and you pull it out when you're having trouble sleeping at night. But it is a pretty important standard as it provides us with definitions. So the definition of a nonconformity, it's a non-fulfillment of a requirement. What are those requirements? We're going to talk about that. And there's a note also, this is one of the important terms within the ISO 9000 and 9001 family. How about corrective action? Well, ISO 9000 defines it as an action to eliminate the cause of a nonconformity and to prevent recurrence. Now, again, this is one of the common terms and core definitions for ISO. They also have a note. There can be more than one cause for a nonconformity. It's interesting. And also, corrective action is taken to prevent recurrence, where preventive action is taken to prevent occurrence. And as you know, with the latest revision of ISO 9001, more of that preventive action has moved towards risk-based thinking. Same idea, to be out in front of the risk, but risk-based thinking is what they call it now as well. Okay, so now we've got an understanding of what the terms mean. Let's talk about nonconformities. Let's talk about what the standard says. So this is from clause 8.7 in the standard, and it says, the organization shall ensure that outputs that do not conform to their requirements, that's highlighted, are identified and controlled to prevent their unintended use or delivery. So let's talk about requirements. What are they referring to? Requirements could be defined in a print or a drawing, let's say, if you're making products to a print. So things like measurements, tolerances, process specifications, such as a particular Rockwell hardness rating, etc. It could be instructions. So there could be some assembly instructions, how to put together a finished product. There could be instructions on a particular standard for a welding stack, let's say. It could be labeling and traceability requirements. So you may have to have proper lock control. Per the standard, you have to have proper identification throughout the life cycle of the product. It could refer to certifications. So do you have to comply with RoHS or REACH, for instance, right? The restriction of hazardous substances. Do you have to comply with conflict minerals, a CE mark certification, anything that your customer is requiring you to comply with? That's a requirement. Materials. If a customer states that this has to be made with 316 stainless steel, it doesn't mean you can go out and get another form of stainless steel. You have to use 316. So those are the requirements. And then the standard says, the organization shall take appropriate action based on the nature of the nonconformity and its effects on the conformity of products and services. So we're going to hone in on that a little bit here. One of the issues that people have with ISO, especially with the 2015 revision, is they feel there's a lot of ambiguity. They feel there are a lot of open-ended mays and shoulds and shalls, and it can be tough. And that's what we're trying to put a little bit of light behind with these sessions. So where are requirements located? Where can I find what that customer is looking for, or that regulatory agency or anybody? And a lot of times you'll find it on a print or a drawing. In fact, a print is a set of instructions in itself, right? Sometimes you find them on POs. So a lot of times there'll be some instructions on a purchase order of how you have to comply with that particular job. And remember, purchase orders are a legally binding document. And there could also be auxiliary documents. So let's say a particular customer, especially if you do business in the DoD supply chain, they may give you a document of their own of rules and regs that you must follow. So it's not specifically called out on a PO. It's not specifically called out on a print, but it's in this guideline and you must follow it. And I can tell you that a lot of the audits I've been doing lately, a lot of the internal audits, I have seen some nonconformances in this area where there is a guideline that exists and it's in somebody's drawer in their desk, and that's where it's been since 1984, and they don't realize it, and they say, but they've accepted the product all this time, it's fine. Well, ISO doesn't care that you've been doing business this way all this time, and that the buyer at this company doesn't pay any mind to this. The fact is, if you've accepted business and agreed to these guidelines, you have to follow them. Otherwise, it could occur in a nonconformance. So let's start with a tip here. A way to make sure that that doesn't happen to us. Identify and understand all requirements prior to acceptance. What does that mean? Acceptance of the work or acceptance of that PO. So in the customer requirements clause of the standard, it states that the organization can meet the claims for the products and services it offers. In other words, you cannot accept work that you cannot do. And that means every single requirement. So it's very important that we understand exactly what the customer is asking for and make sure that we're able to meet it. Before you accept that PO, that is the time to negotiate any discrepancies. So if there's something particular that might be able to be changed, either on a print or an understanding, now is the time to get that customer to agree to that. Of course, you want to have documented evidence of the change, whether it's an updated print or what have you. And the other tip is establish the system with a new customer by which you will be updated to any changes. So for most companies, they will send a version of the print with the PO. So you take that and you issue it to your floor, okay? Other companies won't do that. They're leaving it up to you to manage the print, with the understanding that they'll send along a new revision when one comes down the pike. but don't necessarily take that for granted, okay? You don't want to be in a position where you ship Rev D and you get a call that Rev E is the latest Rev. And, oh, by the way, we didn't have any email from you saying that you moved to Rev E. You want to avoid situations like that. So have a clear understanding of when and who and how that's going to be communicated. Any changes. Okay, so we've had a nonconformity. What are our options? What can we do now? So these are the things that the standard says we can do. You can have a correction, a segregation, or a containment. Certainly inform the customer and obtain authorization for acceptance under concession. So in short, we might be able to use it as is. It may be something that the customer can take. Perhaps it's a scratch when it came back from painting and it's on the underside of the unit. Perhaps it's something else negligible, okay? You get documented evidence from the customer saying, yes, we will accept it with whatever the case is. So you can use it as is. You can scrap it. And when you scrap it, you may start over with virgin raw material, or you may not. Say the customer ordered 10 and one did not come out correctly. Maybe they tell you, just ship me 9. Rework. There's always rework, right? So you can make it right. The one thing the standard says, and it's on the screen, is anytime you do rework, you must verify after the rework has been performed that it conforms to the outputs, okay, to the requirements. And then there's suspension and segregation. So let's say we identify that we've got a problem in our process somewhere. We don't know exactly what it is. We may or may not know where it's occurring. We've got to stop. Because the reality is we could be putting out more nonconformances and we haven't caught them yet. So that's what it means when it talks about suspension and segregation. And you do have a nonconformance area, correct? I can't tell you how many times on an audit I've seen people get written up because they don't have a formally designated and formally labeled nonconformance storage area. So you may have that corner of your shop where all your nonconformances go, and that's wonderful. But if there's not a sign there indicating what it's used for, you could get hit by an auditor during an external or an internal audit. So little bonus tip there for you. Okay, here's another tip. When do you create a nonconformance report? So this is something that I see a lot of companies struggle with. Some companies create NCRs for everything, and other companies don't. Well, this is where we go back to that ambiguity on the standard. So it says necessary or appropriate action based on the nature of the nonconformity. So I always advise, consider the expenditure of resources to make the situation right. So there's basically time and materials. How much of the employee's time could be taken up? How much of a manager's time could be taken up? And if it's serious enough, how much of the owner's time could be taken up? And then on the materials end, are we going to have to use virgin raw material? Are we going to have to use more process aids? Are we going to have to use new or different tooling to make this correct? So let's look at an example. Okay. Here's an example. A polishing operation accidentally scratches a valve, and that valve is a finished good for a customer. The scratch is superficial, and it's easily removed without additional time or material, and the unit conforms to requirements. Should we or should we not create an NCR? So based upon how much expenditure of time and material would it take, if the operator can simply polish it out as part of their process and move along, I wouldn't fill out an NCR for this. You can if you'd like to, and remember, it's your company policy, and whatever you decide as your company policy, you must follow. But I always say, don't paint yourself into a corner either. So think about how you define when you're going to issue an NCR. Okay, let's look at another example. Milling operation. Accidentally mills 125 thousandths over the upper tolerance. Milling operator now has to stop and get a supervisor involved so that a decision can be made. Okay, and that supervisor may or may not reach out to the customer or may bring it up to a higher manager to bring it up with the customer. Point is, we now have wait time we're waiting for a decision to be made, and there's a possibility that they may or may not accept it, and we will have to do something differently. So here, I would issue an NCR, okay? We took up time, and we could possibly take up new materials. There's a cost there. You definitely want to capture that with an NCR. So 2 different examples. Again, you have to define either in your manual or in your policy how you're going to and when you're going to raise a nonconformance report. But once you do so, you've got to stick with it. And what are the documentation requirements? So we talk about a nonconformance report. What does it need to include? Well, this is what the standard says it needs to include: a description, what happened, what did we do to get around, what did we do to make the situation right? What did we do to get that product or that service provided to the customer? Describe any concessions obtained. So that's that conversation back and forth with the customer. And identify the authority deciding the action. So in other words, who is going to make that decision for us? You're going to have the person who comes up with the idea. We're going to either use it as is, or we're going to segregate, or we're going to scrap. And then somebody else has to sign off as the authority figure for that. So create a dedicated nonconformance report that tracks this information. There's your documented evidence. Also, consider creating a nonconformance log to make the following tasks easier: identification of open NCRs, identification of overdue NCRs, and the trending of NCRs over a period of time. So don't forget, when you have your management review meeting, you've got to discuss how are we doing over time. Do we have more NCRs or less? Do we have any that are outstanding, any that are overdue? By creating a simple spreadsheet with that information, you can easily and quickly report on that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about corrective actions. So now we're into clause 10.2 of the standard. So when a nonconformity occurs, including any arising from complaints, so you are doing corrective actions for customer complaints, correct? Okay, so the organization shall react to the nonconformity as applicable, and we talked about this, but look at subclause B. Evaluate the need for action to eliminate the cause in order that it does not recur or occur somewhere else by reviewing and analyzing the nonconformity, determining the causes of the nonconformity, and determining if similar nonconformities exist or potentially could occur. So the major difference between NCR and a CAR is root cause analysis and corrective action. So with the nonconformance report, you're identifying what happened and what did we do to get by it. With the corrective action, now you're doing a formal investigation. How did it happen? How can we prevent it from happening again? And oh, by the way, it continues on here to say that you have to review the effectiveness of corrective actions taken. So some companies will lay out a timeline of 60 or 90 days and say, let's go back and review it. We had any recurrences, okay? And then obviously, if you've had to make any changes to the quality management system as part of your corrective action, you do so and document that appropriately as well. And lastly, it says corrective action shall be appropriate to the effects of the nonconformities encountered. So is it a big expenditure? Is it new equipment? Or is it a smaller expenditure? Is it a simple relayout of an area or an updating of paperwork, let's say, or an SOP? That's up for you to decide. So now, something that I see all the time, and I wanted to throw this in here as a tip. Should we always create a corrective action report? So a lot of companies combine their nonconformance report and a corrective action report into one, so that every little thing that happens, they are doing a corrective action. And the reality is, it's a lot of work to be done correctly. It's a lot of work, and you don't necessarily have to mire yourself in that paperwork. So the answer is not necessarily, right? And here's the guidance that I like to give. You want to consider the frequency of the nonconformance and the intensity of the nonconformance, and let that be your guide as to when you're going to do a corrective action. And of course, make sure that it's reflected in your corrective action policy or in the corrective action section of your quality manual. So let's take a couple more examples. An unforeseen power outage causes a CNC mill to jam apart upon startup. Should we create a corrective action report? Well, we're going to have to create an NCR because we lost a part. Do we need to have a corrective action? Well, unless you can get on the horn with National Grid and say, hey, kindly let me know when somebody's going to strike a telephone pole and I'm going to lose power, there's really no way that you're going to put a corrective action behind this. Now let's look at another example. A shaft has both ends turned out of specification. It gets shipped to the customer. Customer calls us and threatens to find an alternate supplier. Should we create a corrective action? Well, that's a pretty intense problem. And it's intense because now it's put our business with that customer in jeopardy. So yes, in this case, I would create a corrective action. In fact, the customer may issue you a supplier corrective action. So you're going to have to go through this in any case. And as a last example, a matching set of table legs are sawn and found to be uneven. This is the 4th time in the last month that this situation has occurred. Should we create a corrective action? Yes. And the reason is the frequency. So if it's the first time, well, maybe we're not going to do it. We'll do a nonconformance. But maybe we won't do a corrective action. But if this is the 4th time, whether it's the same or different operators, there's an issue there in the process that we're going to have to correct somehow. So hopefully you can see the difference now when you should do a corrective action. People that do it all the time, again, it's a lot of work to be done correctly. You don't want to take shortcuts. You want to make sure you take the time to do it correctly. So make sure you're doing it where it makes sense and make sure that your policies match what you do. Okay? And again, documentation requirements for corrective actions. You have to document the nature of the nonconformity, what you did, the results of corrective actions, and the same tips apply here as they do to the NCR form. Create a dedicated form that tracks this information, and also consider creating a corrective action log so that you know what's open, what's overdue, how are we trending, and don't forget the most important part. Make sure you use you have a proper root cause analysis that uses a relevant root cause analysis tool, such as 5 whys or a fishbone diagram, or however you choose to do it internally. Automotive companies tend to do 8D reports, and that's fine, whatever works for you. Just make sure that you use it. Okay, a bonus tip. So one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Deming, a bad system will beat a good person every time. And that's true. So whenever you're conducting investigations, remove that human element from the equation and focus on the process. And another tip I can give you, don't use human error as a root cause and retraining as a corrective action. Now, I'm going to give you all a moment to sit there and say, we have so many corrective actions with human error as a root cause and retraining as the corrective action. You're not alone, okay? A lot of folks do this. A lot of companies do this. And more I'm starting to see registrars reject corrective actions that use human error as a root cause and retraining as corrective action. And the reason for that is it's ineffective. So you'll notice that over time, you're going to have recurrences and retraining, and it's not effective. You really have to focus on the process and remove that human element from it and say, how can we make this process more streamlined, more efficient, more visual? How can we get earlier feedback? You know, those are all different things that you can look at to help. But please don't use human error as a root cause and retraining as a corrective action. More and more registrars are starting to push back on that. And a last bonus tip. Okay, Erin, I think we need to start charging admission for this because, you know, we're giving away a lot of good tips here. Nonconformances as opportunities. So, are nonconformances a bad thing? They're opportunities for improvement, and they should be treated as such. And that's how the standard approaches them. So a lot of companies look at this and think that it's a bad thing. And a lot of companies will drive metrics and KPIs looking at as little as none non-conformances. That's what we want to strive for. Okay. And if you're taking that approach, if it's working for you, great. But I can tell you it's probably the wrong approach. Okay. Non-conformances are things that are to be celebrated because they're opportunities for improvement. And guess what? Corrective actions, those are an example of a continuous improvement activity that you can use as an input to the continual improvement clause 10.3 of the standard. So when an auditor comes back next year and goes through nonconformances and corrective actions and says, show me what you've had in the last year, and the company proudly sits there and beams and says, we've had none, we couldn't be prouder, that auditor is probably going to look at you and say, you're not doing this correctly. Your quality management system is probably not set up correctly, because certainly you'd be catching something. So they are not a bad thing. You do want to shine a light on them, get the team's input, put some thought into it, and make it better. And that is all part of the continual improvement activity process. So I know we're coming right up on our time here for a half an hour. That is what I have for a presentation today. You can see some contact info on the screen here. Please, any questions, conversation, I am more than open. Also, for those who don't know, I'm more than willing to come in for a site visit or an online visit and talk about a gap analysis or anything else that might be on your mind around your QMS. So my contact info is on the screen. With the few minutes that we have, Erin, why don't we see if we have any questions from the group?
So we did have a question. Hopefully you can hear me. So it actually was related to the root cause analysis tools that you mentioned.
Okay.
And that seemed like you were talking, especially with root cause analysis, it wasn't just about kind of the tool, but rather training around it. Can you talk a little bit more about how you help a team start getting past the idea of punishment and more into correction by using root cause analysis tools?
There's two answers to that. That's a two-part question, right? So then let's start with the second one, which is how do you get the team past the idea that it's bad? It starts with top management commitment, right? So the standard itself, section 4 and 5, talk about leadership. Top management has to commit to the quality system and give opportunity for folks to be able to identify and perform root cause analysis and put improvement processes in place. So if there's facilities where discipline, let's say, is a common approach, that's where you start to get people who want on board. Okay, so there's a culture there. But the first part of that question, the root cause analysis tools, you definitely want to provide training to the folks who are doing it, because you have to show competence according to section clause 7.2, right? So if you have auditors, internal auditors, who are doing root cause analysis, you want to be able to show that they are competent to do such. And that is by showing that they've had some root cause analysis training. Now, lucky for you, that happens to be training that Polaris MEP can provide for you. And I'm certainly open to a conversation around that as well. So one, make sure that top management is committed to improvement. And two, make sure that people have the proper training if they're going to perform root cause analysis.
Thank you very much for that explanation, because I know we were joking at the beginning of this that I think a lot of people worry that ISO or any quality management system is all about paperwork, documentation. But what I'm hearing from you today especially is that when you're looking at it, it's really about the training around the scenario, the training around the process, so it doesn't beat a good person down, and so that you deliver what your customers and the auditors are requiring of you. Big part of it?
Big part of it, correct. So documentation has its place. It's a lot less stringent than it used to be in past versions of ISO, but also culture, training, processes, efficiencies. There's a big tie-in with lean manufacturing when you're talking about ISO 9000 or any of the ISO standards. So a lot of that culture applies as well. So it is a multi-tiered approach. So I'm glad that question was asked.
Excellent. Well, thank you to the person who was brave enough to send it to me as a direct question. Anybody else have a question for Chris before we close up today? If so, please feel free to unmute yourself and shout out. If not, I know that Chris has his information up on the screen, and he'd be happy to be a resource for you at any time, wherever you are in your certification journey. All right. Thank you so much for helping us take a bite out of ISO today, Chris. And to everybody else who attended, we look forward to talking with you more.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.